Fabulous. Very simple path to victory from opening government. We're going to explain firstly why when you get bad outcomes, you can better insulate against risk and deal with these problems far, far quicker. And secondarily, why you're likely to get good outcomes. First, some setup. I think the biggest status quo fears that prevent you from doing criticism in the first place as an employee are job loss and bad character perception and potentially being like knocked out of consideration for promotions. We really think that given that this comes from corporate, is you are like they are far more legally liable if these impacts actually come into fruition, specifically through mechanisms we have in status quo. The HR gets stronger. There's wrongful determination lawsuits. There's discrimination lawsuits. All of these particular things. I'll prove why this is feasible for people later, but I think this is something to note. What do these disagreements actually look like then? We think these look like different angles on work, more productive project reviews, feedback systems that are continuously put in place, well implemented, and in a public setting in a way in which multiple employees are able to chime in on an issue and have a productive, meaningful conversation about it. On their side of the house, let's be very clear, this happens in email chains, in anonymous forms, in phone calls, something which is very he said, she said, in a way in which isn't as actionable and isn't as productive. Why is this likely to be done well? 5 reasons. Firstly, the financial benefit, and this is just the empirical one. Insofar as there is a potentially huge profit to be made, insofar as you can better adapt to norms of cancel culture, adapt to potential criticism that the wider audience might have, this is in and of itself a good thing. And this is in the interest of both the employer who wants to get promoted and the project manager who wants to maximize profit so he looks good to his CEO, CFO, and all of his bosses. This has actually worked in Netflix, fun fact. Eli will talk about this later. But I just think that you get less public backlash because these concerns are listened to and nipped in the bud quickly. Let's chat about Netflix, actually, because notice the fact that a lot of their originals don't get cancelled first season. These originals that Netflix promotes actively do well because they have strong internal criticism mechanisms, which means that you have less of a capacity for failure. They do the pilot groups. They have public forums to do this. And if anyone is caught not listening, they actively publicly explain why the project manager was fired or why like the ultimate thing failed and wasn't listened to. There are active harms if you are negligent as a project manager, which they don't get on their side of the house as much given the power dynamics. Secondly, confirmation biases. You want this to work well, you assume this will be done well, and so this actively rewires the way you perceive criticism into a way which is just far more open to having a productive resolution to it. Thirdly, public debriefs and checks and balances. This Netflix example is tantamount to this example. Insofar as you'll listen to multiple people and multiple witnesses, you feel on the spot in a way to do so. Up will say, but you're an insecure person and like you won't receive this well and you'll get really angry. But we really think with a constant indoctrination of this, and if your corporate is telling you to do this, you can't have an visceral reaction to this. You can't do this in a way that is particularly bad. Fourthly, it comes as less of a surprise when you receive criticism because you think it's less personal and you actively opt into this. And this is really important for all the insecurity that alt might run. Most criticism that people perceive and perceive badly is because they think it is a personal attack on them, a personal attack on their identity, a personal attack on their abilities. When the corporate culture narrative is that we're trying to do this for profit and we're trying to prevent worse things happening in the future, you look for resolutions and you yourself as the criticizer phrase this criticism in a way which has multiple resolutions, and you explicitly spell this out for the project manager in and of itself so that you don't perceive this way. But finally, there's a self-selection mechanism here. Managers who listen are the most likely to succeed, as the opposite are fired for poor performance. If someone fucks up and one of your employees literally preempted this, you are liable and you are held to account. But even if this doesn't happen, I think just the core premise that this is the culture and you are disobeying it is enough for like higher management to not consider you for promotions. Why then is this likely to be received well? Several reasons. Firstly, when you're constantly faced with criticism, each criticism impacts you less. You become desensitized to the shallower things and you take serious things seriously without feeling like it's an attack on your personal identity. Think of how novices interpret like calls and criticism when they first start out in debating versus pro-debaters, which can take meaningful criticism about their mechs being EPLE or whatnot in these particular ways. Secondly, there's active profit incentives, and this changes the way you fundamentally think about being like promoted as a person. On their side of the house, you think about optics and you care about the way in which you're perceived. On our side of the house, you care about outcomes and you care about the like necessary things that could make you like look better and have ultimate profit for the company. And I just think crucially, you get more agency over your team if they feel like they are listened to. This is an incentive to act well. Thirdly, it constantly motivates you to do better so you don't face any criticism in the future. Oftentimes, as pro debaters, get feedback, internalize it deeply, implement it in the next round, and take a clean first. This is exactly what I'm doing here. And I just think this is the way in which you prevent this criticism occurring in the future, because repeat instances imply an unproductive work culture. This makes you look like a shit manager. Fourthly, even if you're a minority and your management doesn't care on either side of the house, I'll take you after this, you still have a lot more ammunition against the offenders. Given that this criticism is codified, it is no longer he said, she said, but that witnesses can testify in favor of you. And they obviously have an incentive to do this insofar as all of the profit incentives I talked about, insofar as they care about you and they care about your outcomes, uniquely in a way which HR can't capacitize. I'll take CO.
How do you think worker union and labor unions are affected by this culture?
I don't think this is as important to the debate as our impacts. I think at the point where workers have more autonomy, this is logically prior to you needing these workers and labor unions in the first place. But I think these makes the worker and labor unions far more stronger, because if your own company culture is indoctrinated into criticism being in and of itself a good thing, you are far more likely to take this from external actors who are actively in support of your workers. Finally, then, it is far better to receive this preventatively than prognostically. It is better to receive this from your own employees and your own labor and trade unions than from the wider public when you've royally fucked up. I think the impacts of this are fairly intuitive. Finally, why do you get better outcomes and some weighing? Firstly, you preempt and resolve problematic things faster because these, like the criticisms you're doing, are more public versus the comparatives I talk about in my framing. Things like phone calls and messages can get easily lost and forgotten, but things in public forums you never forget. Secondly, you end up phrasing criticism in a way that is more actionable. I already talked about this. Thirdly, even if this fails, at the bare minimum, you have a higher capacity to criticize CEOs and CFOs for most important decisions that they make. You may not change the way they act and the way they pass legislation for your company, but you might change their behavior if it becomes so public, if the criticism is so public. But I just think this changes behavior, and this is in and of itself a good outcome because you get better checks and balances. People say, but instability, but all of the incentives I talked about at the top of my framing prove why you won't do this in pernicious ways. We weigh because this impact is certain, and this is logically prior to any outcomes and any degradation of your management structures that Alt might want to claim, because people have the capacity to be less insecure about their workplace interactions. Beg you to propose.
Thank you, PM, for your fine speech. Leader of opposition, you have the floor.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'll just start in a couple of seconds. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. When people are constantly criticized while working from 9 to 5 every single day and slaving away at a workplace that probably does not already care a lot about their humanity, their reaction is to not get desensitized to the pain and take it all productively. The reaction, more often than not, is to internalize a lot of those criticisms, to constantly feel bad and be reminded about their shortcomings, and to then feel even more alienated from the workplace and the work that they are doing. Very proud to oppose. I think a couple of things here. I'm going to give you lots of reasons for why, because of the way that this is likely to manifest, why certain impacts within the debate are more likely to accrue than other impacts. What is this crucial framing then? I think 3 points over here. The first crucial framing is, as per the motion, these are attempts made by corporate, made by people in positions of power as well. I think what this ultimately looks like is arranging particular public forums for employees, or particular public meetings where employees can verbally voice out their concerns, talk about things that are bothering them, so on and so forth. It doesn't, at no point does opening government or GovBench in general have fiat to assume that these and like these verbal criticisms or these expressions of dissent actually meaningfully change the way that CEOs or people at the head of these companies actually change the way that policies that are so deeply entrenched within the way that their businesses work are likely to change, or the way that these employees are paid, or the kind of labor conditions that they work are suddenly going to change. I think what happens is this is used as a way to pacify employees. The second important piece of framing then is, like, as per OG concedes, oftentimes because of external fears and paranoias that you have, certain people are likely to just buy into this less, even if it is a culture, even if, let's say, like something else is a culture within society, there is still a degree to which what kind of people opt in more, what kind of people opt in less. So at least, the ability to opt in exists on a spectrum, and it is directly proportional to the sort of job security that you have, which looks like people who are in relative positions of power, i.e. managers or senior associates, having more ability, leeway, and justification to criticize the people around them. This is also amplified by the intersection of other aspects of your identity. Whether you're a man, you're probably more emboldened and likely to opt into this culture, as opposed to a woman, where even if you are perhaps told by your manager that, hey, you can criticize, you can share your opinions, you're probably likely to double and triple think that before saying anything, because you have a child at home that you need to provide for, and hence you cannot risk saying something that might not maybe directly cause you to get fired, but might piss off your boss, which might harm your promotion in the long run. So just because a culture is being encouraged within the workplace doesn't mean that people don't get offended at things that are being said. It doesn't mean that there isn't a spillover effect of the things that you are saying indirectly and unconsciously onto other people. Your relationship with your coworkers are likely to be impacted in the world where you're constantly criticizing or talking about all of the negatives of the way negative aspects of the way that the current employees around you are working. The third important piece of framing then is I think because of the initial sort of analysis I've given you, I think there are ways for people in positions of power to actively, indirectly or directly use this in ways that directly harm employees, and there's probably little to no protection that employees can have against these. What does this likely look like? I think firstly, directly this could look like listening to the sort of open, casual conversations that employees are having within these forums. Like if they're talking shit about the way corporate or your people in the headquarters treat them, then you as a managers have more ammunition to use against them, or to report, or maybe you have the sort of obligation or intrinsic responsibility to report things like whether you sense there's going to be some union activity, whether you think certain employees are getting too critical, there's a chance of them being whistleblowers, etc. I think you just I think when you let your guard down as employees, you just give a lot of direct ammunition for people within positions of power to use against you. But a lot of this just happens indirectly as well. Even if I'm a manager who's openly encouraging, criticizing me, probably if you say something bad about the way I work or the way I've been treating you, that's gonna affect my relationship with you in the long run. So maybe next time when I'm assigning work to you, I will be a little bit pissed off. I will maybe treat you a little bit worse. I might give you a little bit more harsh feedback and justify it in the name of productive feedback. And honestly, just because you say the word productive at opening government doesn't necessarily prove these are productive ways of criticizing things. I think on our side of the house, you have several other channels you can use. When there's a direct conflict with another entity or another person, when you can have a more structured formal complaint with HR, these direct channels are much more better because there's no spillover effect and unintentional effect over unintentional effect onto other co-workers, etc. You're much more conscious. You're much more planned out and thoughtful about what you're saying and whether it's even worth complaining about in the first place. And I think those perhaps channels are much better in that sense. But also you can do things like encourage a culture of positive reinforcement where you can talk about how to improve things within the company without necessarily bringing people down or complaining about why something is wrong. That's the sort of intrinsic difference between criticism and positive reinforcement, reinforcement. Positive reinforcement would be like accepting and appreciating things that actually work. I think based on these framings, there are several like impacts within the debate. I think firstly, you just create a culture of fear and paranoia where your coworkers are where there's a risk of you upsetting your coworker, because even if you don't say anything directly about them, they might disagree with you, and hence that disagreement can lead to tensions in the long run within the workplace, which can then affect your ability to feel happy within the workplace, but also your ability to cohesively work together within a team, because now almost every week you're probably voicing out a lot of disagreements, and they don't just stay within that room. Obviously they carry forward if there are things that you actually care about. But B, you especially amplify voices against minorities who don't have the social capital or the psychological safety to voice out as much concerns. You justify things like microaggressions, things like racist or like just rude, angry remarks towards minorities and women and people of color, and you justify them, or you give people the ability to justify those comments as just criticisms and dissent, instead of the status quo where you have an obligation to remain professional. You can't say anything too rude. You can't say anything that could be perceived as harmful to another person. So you err on the side of caution in the status quo, and you don't say things that are problematic. For all of those reasons, we support a healthier workplace where you remain professional, you take things to the proper channels. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Alo. Can we have the PM?
Well, just checking that I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
I take POIs verbally, so if you would please just shout at me, that would be ideal. Thank you. Two responses directly to opening opposition, then an additional case to our case, and weighing out our case. First, note, yeah, we have no fiat, but I think that we actively give incentives for why the corporate leaders have incentives to act on this culture, why whenever you're creating a culture of dissent, you have incentives to build this culture into an actionable culture. I think that Krish tells you this at the top of his speech, but I'd like to flag that directly. Secondarily, on ammunition and like relationship change, I think that you're structurally less likely to reach out to HR and status quo, because at the end of the day, they're always beholden to upper management. A thing that's true on both sides, but on our side, whenever they claim that they accept criticism, then they have a far stronger incentive to side with you, at least sometimes, that doesn't exist ever on opposition side of the house. And also, your own argument is legitimized because you empirically have more evidence, you have more things that are written down, you have more things that are proven. Because one of the things that we told you in the way that this is likely to manifest is that in order for a culture of dissent to be actionable, and in order for it to have the financial benefits Krish talks about, you need to have it be somewhat like written down. I'm not certain the word for it, but you need to have it be transcribed in a way that you can use it in the future. Because if you just say things and you have this culture of dissent, but you never use it positively, then there's no incentive to instill this culture of dissent, and there's no incentive to act on it. But if you want the financial benefits or any of the other benefits Krish talks about, you have to codify it in some degree. So this means that then whenever you go to HR with a complaint about why you were not promoted, and you believe it's because of a particular kind of dissent that you promoted, you have the evidence that you gave this dissent, and you have the evidence of the way that it was responded to. And so you are much more likely to have the backing and have the records that are necessary in order to do widespread things like discrimination lawsuits, if the discrimination is actually as bad as opening opposition would like to say it is. Okay, why is the culture better? I think there's 4 broad reasons for this. The first one is you just get more agency. Whenever you have the capacity to criticize, then this means and the incentive to criticize, and you're told that you ought to do this, then I think that then you feel more reclamation over the actions that you're taking. You feel as though the things that you're doing matter to some degree, because you see that sometimes you give criticism and it's acted upon, and occasionally this means you can change the outcome of your work product, which I think just means that you feel as though you have more value in your contributing to the company. Whereas on opposition side of the house, even if you do give criticism, because it this not formalized, it could be claimed that, oh, this was someone else's idea, perhaps this was your manager's idea, or alternatively, you could just never see the impact of it at all. I think that whenever you instill a culture of dissent, then you instill a culture of agency that is unique to our side. But secondarily, I think that you have the potential for advancement even if you're not an outgoing person, because I think that all of the incentives for why you are likely to do more criticism as a majority member as opposed to as a minority member exist on both sides of the house. But at least on our side, as a minority member, you have an external imposition upon you that advocates for you to do more speaking up, to do more criticism, that your good ideas are heard, which means that the people who have potential for advancement are not always the loudest people, which is what you have to stand behind on opposition side of the house, because the highest risk is also the highest reward. Whenever you criticize an outgoing product and you say this is going to be financially not viable, that is the highest risk you can take in your career, but it also is the thing that's most likely to get you a promotion, the thing that's most likely to push you into the upper echelons of management. On our side of the house, it's much more likely that minorities or women or people of other externalities upon them are likely to voice their concerns whenever they have them, and that means that the best idea is likely to get you a promotion as opposed to just being the loudest, which is another reason why your culture is better. A third reason is I think there's just a built comfort and reciprocity. Whenever you criticize your manager, in addition to your manager criticizing you, even if there's an asymmetry to the degree at which you criticize your manager in comparison to them criticizing you, because you built this criticism, and because you feel as though you have some amount of power over them or some amount of like things you can say to them, because you don't feel as though you're silenced and pressured, you begin to build a relationship with them that is exclusive to our side of the house. On your side of the house, you have to stand behind them, be suffering under these pressures of not criticizing and therefore never having the capacity to build this relationship. I just think this relationship is probably important to having a somewhat positive work environment. And I think that also this is a prerequisite to you building this desensitivity at all, because on their side of the house, you are criticized in performance reviews and in things like that, but you take it much more personally because you have never been in the position to criticize someone else, so you don't understand the thought processes that go into that, and you don't understand that it's not actually personal. But whenever you're able to build this reciprocity, you get a better understanding of how criticism works, and then you're better able to accept it whenever it inevitably happens to you. I think the fourth one is that criticism needs to be actionable in order for anyone to gain this comparative benefit, which then builds a competition mechanism, right? You start competing to give the best criticism possible. You want to get better criticism than the person next to you, and therefore the criticism itself gets better and it gets more actionable increasingly, which I think just means the culture itself gets better because you're better able to act on it and you do not give irrelevant criticism. Lastly, then, on why there is no existing incentive to criticize. First, all of the reasons that opening oppositions give you, but secondarily, I think that there's also a certain degree of ownership of the work that you've produced and pride that exists within your work. You don't have a desire or an incentive to criticize it in absence of this culture, and so you are not going to, which then just means things are going to get missed. I'll go on to impacting, but first I'd like to take a POI from closing if they have one.
Why do you think upper management would listen to these criticisms?
Because they have to. They're going to listen to these criticisms because if they're promoting a culture of dissent, but they're never actually listening to it, they look like hypocrites. They get external criticism from things like media attention and media pressures, and also just their own initiative then feels as though it's a failure. Krish has already given you 5 reasons why they feel as though they have to listen to this. Please track Krish's speech better. Okay, then what is the outcome? I think that on their side of the house, there's no identification of the actual problems that exist, in addition to there just being worse culture for the 4 reasons I just gave you. So the weighing is pretty simple. On our side of the house, we're able to get better culture for people who engage in this because criticism is inevitable, but at least our criticism is better, and also you're better prepared for it whenever it does eventually come into play. So I think that you do not suffer all the psychological impacts they tell you, so you're able to better engage with culture, with your company. But because you're better able to engage with your company, then you're a more productive member of the company, which then just means that the company itself does better, which means there's financial benefits that are relatively impactful. Because whenever every single company, or whenever a significant number of companies take this action and then are able to bulletproof against failures and are able to bulletproof against inevitable mistakes that could have been prevented but were not identified earlier on in the process because either someone saw it and never spoke up about it, or no one saw it at all, then this just means that there's more resiliency against economic shocks, which means fewer people lose their jobs in the worst case scenario.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. Please remind everyone to please be conscious of your microphone and activate dialogue.
Sorry for earlier, we forgot the mic open. Sorry to the speaker.
No. All right. Am I visible, audible?
Yes to both.
Perfect. All right. Starting. Just let me set my timer. Okay. 3, 2, 1. At Top Bench, we ask a very simple question. What's the end point of all these measures? Are they actually going to lead to any sort of structural change? Let's assess the mechanisms that proposition gives. Number one, because of the fact that the corporation is introducing this culture, therefore they have an incentive to maintain that culture. I would posit that intuitively, you've seen a lot of the corporations introduce cultures such as being LGBTQ friendly, being, for example, open to various races, being open to sort of like women and women participation. A lot of these times, these measures tend to be extremely tokenistic, especially when they sort of like begin in the first place. So we have no idea why that's going to be necessarily true, or like why we should buy that on intuition without any more analysis than we sort of like got. So that's pretty speculative. But then secondly, because of the fact that there are greater legal protections, I would ask the question of why those legal protections are necessarily stronger than the wrongful dismissal protections that already exist within the status quo. The mechanism that they give to be extremely charitable is that there's more like it's logistically easier to pursue complaints because, well, you have email chains, you have a lot more written material. I would argue that on the counterfactual that Anam talked about, where you're actually taking complaints to like the requisite parties within the corporations that already exist, those are likely to have far more text chains. Insofar as if you study, for example, proposition first framing, they actually concede to the idea that when you're dealing with traditional measures, you're actually far more likely to have email threads detailing the types of problems that you face. HR meetings that you are going to be in are likely going to be logged. There are generally going to be notes of like every single everything that the meetings was generally about. So I would say that in fact the counterfactual is that the alternative is actually truer. Insofar as there's a culture of criticism, what's going to end up happening is that insofar as you've promoted the ability of every individual to criticize everyone else, the criticism is going to be extremely dispersed. It's not going to be in a singular location. People are going to cross each other's desks and like pass on just a note, just constructive advice over there. We think that this actually ends up looking like a lot less, trackable than the way that it works within the status quo. So we're actually not sure why that sort of like works. DPM adds a new mechanism of media attention, which I'm not sure how that works. You can't just throw that out there and expect us to engage with it. I don't know why the media has an incentive to pursue this. I don't know why they would hold them accountable. I don't know why the media would have access to like how this corporation is going to set up this culture or like the types of liabilities that they have. I can't engage with something that you just throw out as a mech and expect to sort of like get assessed. The second thing that I would want to like engage on is a lot of propositions benefits hinge on whether or not people perceive criticism in a way that actually mechanizes their benefits about creating a good work culture where there's a lot of accountability. I would argue, and we've contested this at opening opposition as well, people don't perceive criticism that well. Why is this true? Number one, people live under capitalism. They're extremely tired. They're extremely stressed. They're constantly being made to feel like they are not enough. The way that narratives at the of commodification sort of like work around the status quo, you are never like a man enough. You are never a father or a mother enough. You are never somebody who's like a good enough partner. You're never a good enough like a person who has like a lot of capital, so on and so forth. You are generally in a position of inferiority constantly, and we think that all the people who've criticized you, and you can intuition check this, most of the people tend to do so with sufficient reasoning. I'm not sure why the work culture is saying that, oh, we're also going to criticize you the same way you've been criticized all of these by all of these other frames, but now we also have sufficient reasoning because we're trying to like improve the profitability of the business, is going to make people perceive criticism suddenly differently. Because notice, and this is what Anand points out, this criticism and the culture of criticism isn't being accompanied by positive feedback. You're basically giving all your employees carte blanche licenses to go out and talk about and basically like talk shit about each other, and in the name of like constructive feedback. And when that tends to happen, we don't think people get desensitized. Also on desensitization, that's a very interesting mechanism, by the way, to bring up as well, because assuming that they say that people are likely to get desensitized to criticism, I'm also then not sure how their like benefits mechanized. Because if people eventually get so desensitized that they stop caring about the criticism, then eventually criticism becomes less of an effective metric in the debate, and therefore all the benefits that they're trying to say about like criticism being taken seriously and being a catalyst for change automatically also falls down. So I'm not sure why that works, but why exactly what exactly has opening opposition brought about that hasn't been challenged in this debate so far? Number one, And they concede this when they talk about the idea that being or that criticizing is going to pose a risk. By the way, like that is DPM's framing, that if you it's the highest form of risk that you can take if you try to actually criticize an officer. I will take closing in a minute, by the way. If you try to criticize one of the people in upper management, it's a high risk associated with that sort of backfiring. We've then pointed out to you that if that is so, then the types of people who are likely to criticize are likely to be people within upper management, people within lower management, people who are minorities, who are already aware that they are at a systemic position of disprivilege, are far less likely to exercise this criticism, which means they're far more likely to actually, regardless of the type of culture that exists, generally silence themselves. What that ends up creating is a system where the top ends up being extremely toxic and ends up sort of perpetuating this sort of system. Why is the counterfactual necessarily better? Because on the side of the counterfactual, which is the status quo, you have authorities within the normal business which are, number one, trained to handle criticism, which is to say that when you actually go and talk to HR, the HR actually knows how to process your complaint. They're actually aware of, for example, how to sort of access your complaints, how to sort of make you feel heard, how to actually take action in a way that doesn't cause conflict. The type of conflicts that you're going to be causing by giving out random criticism is going to be far less actionable. The people that you're criticizing don't necessarily know how to receive that criticism. You don't necessarily know how to create that give that criticism. The impact of that, far more friction. Before I move on to accountability, very quick POI closing.
Look, HR exists in government as well, right? So why is upper management critiquing upper management necessarily uniquely bad?
Yeah, the reason why it's exclusively bad is because the way that the current system works, you have two things. Number one, you have no option but to go to HR and also directly go to managers and hold them accountable directly, as opposed to this extremely diffused version of criticism where you're actually being able to criticize outside of these circles with no actual email chains, which makes it far less actionable. But number two, insofar as you have the ability to actually to have the guard of professionalism, which we think professionalism is a very important metric in this debate that enforces people being nice to each other and generally making sure that they're far kinder to each other when having those conversations. We think that that's going to be extremely important in making sure minorities and individuals feel a lot more safer, people feel a lot less burnt out, and therefore all the benefits the opening government is talking about businesses working better actually get mechanized on our side of the house when that becomes far truer. But notice, by the way, that we think that insofar as that, and just to continue this, be answering this POI, we don't think it's just going to be upper management criticizing upper management. We think this is probably going to happen on different levels as well. But insofar as people within positions of power are going to be criticizing people who are not in positions of power, we think that the brunt of that is also going to be faced by people within disprivilege, creating toxic work cultures, creating horrible work environments, creating burnout. For all these reasons, vote opening opposition.
Thanks, DLO, for your speech. MG?
Okay. Just to confirm, I can be clearly heard.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I will take POIs verbally, but with preference to OO. Okay. I have 3 extensions. 1, why we get lots of departmental change, which improves workers' lives on the ground. Secondly, why the most vulnerable workers are better off on our side, which will flip OO's claim. And finally, why this makes unions better, this will preempt CEO's claims. Firstly then, why we get lots of departmental change, which improves workers. The issue with OG and OO is that they kind of just sound like company executives with little regard of how these policies actually help people on the ground. They think a lot of it is on a company or structural level. It's about how Netflix operates. It's about how upper management works. But I would argue a majority of dissent, especially if you're a young worker in a company, you're in the most lower levels, you're like a salesperson, for instance, is about the inner workings of your department. And it's changes within the department about efficiency, which can make your life a lot easier. It's not about upper management and profit and structural issues. It's literally just about how it works within your department, how division of work is, for instance, what programs and softwares you use, what the chain of work actually looks like in terms of division, like what processes you go through to actually achieve your sales outcome, for instance, or your compliance outcome, or your accounting outcome. I have 2 things I want to say then. Number 1, why is it unlikely that people can actually complain right now and have their dissents actually listened to in terms of company efficiency? I think oftentimes there's very little avenue to bring this up, and you just don't know whether or not your boss will be receptive. So if you're like, I don't know whether this software is good, I think there's just very little avenue you would say this otherwise. You can't really bring it up in a meeting, for instance, because you're talking about other things. There's no formal complaint avenue that you can talk about in the status quo. Why then will your boss likely to actually be relatively receptive? Always claim here is that it's very easy for people to be offended. That when you listen to things, you just get really pissed because they're criticizing you as a person. But the issue is, These sort of claims are not often about person versus person. It's just a criticism of the system and processes as a whole, and so I think you're far less likely to actually get offended. This then outweighs OG, because OG never actually explains that people won't get offended. We actually give you a different mechanism as to why this is the case. It is when you say, oh, I don't think we should be using Oracle to document our sales compensation. Oh, I think we should use like a different contractor for like, the materials that we use, or things about division of work. Oftentimes, it's not an explicit criticism of your boss, but it's just like something that can be taken really like feasibly, for instance, or that your immediate boss can change without escalating it as a whole. Therefore, on our side, I think you're likely just able to get these departmental changes far easier. That you have more avenues to talk about it in the first place. That there's like literally forums for you to be able to do it, or like feedback forums every so often that you're able to escalate these concerns very quickly. I think when it doesn't require explicit approval from like the CEO of your company, and it only requires your immediate boss to just approve these changes or like work around it in the first place, I think these changes in the form are achievable under our side. And I just want to note, this outweighs OG, because OG talks about structural changes. Our claim is not about structural changes. It's about changes that exist within your small department of like 10 people, for instance. This is often the changes people most pressingly face in when you work, for instance. Obviously, I think as a day-to-day, it is far more important than what you face structurally. Because oftentimes when you work, for instance, you have to face it for 8 hours a day, 5 hours a week. The sales program you use, the Google like Excel sheets you use, and how the formulas work often just is far more important to you as in terms of your workflow and how stressed you are. Whereas structural change just doesn't happen on either side. Like, let's be real. I don't think structural change is going to happen given that there's so many barriers to do it in the first place, and given that upper management is just really profit-oriented in the first place. So I think OG's impacts are far less feasible. Ours are just something that can reasonably happen to a large degree and actually improve people's lives on the ground. Therefore, I think in terms of just margin of change, we actually improve the lives of lower workers far more because they are far more affected by these daily workings. Second extension then, why the most vulnerable workers are better off. I want to point out two framings which will contrast with OO. Number one, people will still complain and vent their frustrations on both sides of the house. OO's claim is they want people to be professional. But no, if you don't have an official venue to be professional, you'll probably just be like passive aggressive. You just make snarky comments. You just talk over Microsoft Teams chat informally. But number two, on both sides, people in the majority or in higher tiers of the company will have more power. This is probably just true given how the structure of the company works. You have bosses, bosses of bosses, etc. Why is it better then that we have a professional and codified avenue for people to actually complain, rather than people just complaining informally? OO's claim here is that it's better that informal complaints exist, because you have no choice but to go for HR if you're being if the microaggressions against you. I want to correct OO. You have two options, right? One is to go to HR, one is to do nothing. Many times, people do nothing and they don't often escalate to HR. This is because they often think their complaints are insignificant. That there's only one incident that the person was being passive aggressive to you, and you don't think this issue is just important enough to go to HR in the first place. On our side of the house, with these relatively small and low-level complaints, for instance, a conversation you had with your colleague that you'd rather just have in a formal environment, that's when you can actually say, look, I want this to be held in the weekly complaints forum, and I want this to be disputed in like a professional environment, rather than being informal. On their side of the house, they have no option to do this. On our side, when the culture actually exists, and you push for more discussion in terms of these spaces, and more avenues for you to be able to do so, it's far easier to actually take these complaints out of the informal sphere in terms of your chat, for instance, to actually go and have it with your boss or have it with other coworkers. On their side of the house, you won't escalate to HR because it's not severe enough, but now your complaints aren't being heard, you aren't being properly addressed, and it is far worse for the workers on a lower level. But the second reason and menu extension as to why it is better is because you're actually able to have lots of like shutdown of like microaggressions from like upper levels. I think a large issue is people just don't take the like upper levels, like your boss, for instance, is like often yelling at you, like or like just like being really aggressive towards you, take it far less seriously. Oftentimes, as stated, it's because you just think it is like less serious, for instance, that they're just yelling or expressing their frustrations. But there is a culture of dissent. The upper management often cares far more about this issue. They want to actually not suppress the dissent, but encourage it. So what they do start caring about is whether or not your bosses are actually nice to the workers, that your boss is actually welcoming and friendly as opposed to being mean. I think in terms of this, you just tell the people to like have company directives to make them be nicer. It's far easier for you to go to far easier for you to talk to your boss's boss about it, far easier to just get departmental change, and your boss will just be preemptively more silent because they just don't want to be like called out in the first place. So in terms of your boss being nicer to you, if you're a woman, for instance, there are fewer microaggressions. That's the second most benefit we claim on our side. Finally, then on unions before that opening.
So insofar as this corporation is encouraging everyone to complain and everyone is hearing like everybody else's issues, won't they get desensitized and minorities would feel a lot less likely to bring up their issues?
But I don't see why you would be desensitized, because the complaints are all about different things, and you presumably you care about like efficiency complaints, but you also care about minority complaints. It's not clear why they're the same thing and why they actually trade off with each other. I guess simultaneously care about which system my company uses and also care about LGBTQ rights, not exclusive. Okay, about unions then. This will preempt CO. Why do you get more people joining unions? People in the status quo often have issues with joining unions. They think the cost of dissenting is too high, like they will get fired for speaking out, or the boss just won't like them, or there's just fewer concerns that they just care deeply about, partially because they have less awareness of this issue, but even if they are aware of the issues that people face, for instance, in the workplace, they aren't understanding of how important it is. How do unions help this under our side of the house? I think you're just aware of more issues in the first place. In the weekly complaint form, or when you have like complaint discussions, I think you just realize your own issues just are not like your own individualized issues, but are systemic. The fact that there are often microaggressions in the company, and you often face issues with not having enough like a leave, like as a woman, for instance. I just feel the need to have like more. I think the second thing though is you actually realize how collectivization works. That you understand that there's also people who are with you, who share your concerns, and you're actually more likely to join a union as a result. Therefore, on our side of the house, you're far more likely to actually think unions are the better solution for this, that unions actually work, and they will actually like it's actually really important for you to join one. So on our side, you have stronger unions. Secondly, then, we actually mitigate the weaknesses of unions. The issue with unions is that they often disproportionately prioritize the wrong issues, or that they care most about the union members. On our side, when you have a more diverse and larger selection of people in unions in the first place, because more people join, that's better union policy pushes that actually help women, who help minorities, who help the majority of workers, as opposed to just the select few in the union.
Thank you very much, LG. Emo?
So, can you turn off the fan? Okay, hi. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. The gap in this debate is that every one of the other three teams are trying as hard as they can to minimize their burden and minimize the debate. Opening government thinks the burden is to explain why, because of this culture, people will be more able to receive criticism without actually explaining why this criticism is likely to be good and lead to some good outcome. Opening opposition wants to argue that these attempts will all fail and not actually create this culture of dissent, at which point it's unclear what the debate is actually about and where they find the harm. Closing government wants this dissent to be only about like the location of the printer or very minor things that at the end of the day, it's unclear what you need the culture in the first place to achieve, but also don't really matter. What are we going to argue today as closing opposition? Quite frankly, that these decisions are going to, this dissent and these criticisms are going to affect important decisions of the company, and that these are going to lead to bad outcomes for the company and therefore for society. Why then do we think this culture of dissent is going to meaningfully affect important decisions of the company? By this, we think we mean things like acquisitions, or where the acquisition of the company is going to be, things like wages, things like hiring processes, or things like what products are we going to focus on selling, etc. Why is it going to be, to some degree at least, about these things? Obviously, it can also be about the much more minor things that closing governments wants to focus on, but we think the debate is primarily in terms of the bigger issues because they have greater impact. The first reason for this is that opening government literally tells us. We POI them and we ask them why it is the case that upper management and CEOs are going to have to listen to these criticisms, and they tell us that they have to listen to them because there's going to be backlash and because they've set up the system. Like, we agree with them, right? This means that closing government can't pretend like the only issues addressed are like the really minor ones. But secondly, because otherwise we think there's no point to this effort, right, this exercise, because workers end up feeling disenchanted when they're told that they should give feedback and then no feedback is actually received. But thirdly, we think there's a snowball effect here. The more you accept criticism and the more you say that we are open to criticism and that we will take this on board and make a lot of the changes you propose, the harder it is then to say that, and you are and look hypocritical to your employees rather, when you say that, oh, on this issue, we won't accept your feedback. On that issue, we don't think you are qualified to talk about. Why? Okay, so clearly then we are talking about important decisions. Why then will this criticism lead to bad outcomes and bad decisions for the company? The first reason for this is because I don't think employees have a macro understanding of the company and what the company does overall. They have a better understanding probably than their managers about like these small details in terms of their day-to-day jobs, in terms of the specific tasks that they have to do and their specific profession. No, thank you about the POI, but we don't think they understand the macro level this much. For instance, a nurse at a private hospital may know their patient and think that, hey, having a human to be there and help the patient is something that is good for that patient. But what that nurse may not recognize is that by replacing a lot of what nurses do with like mechanical chairs or whatever, you can get access to like less overworked nurses and, for instance, free up like 5 million on the budget, which can allow you to pay for like hundreds of ventilators to save lives. But the second reason here as to why a lot of this criticism is bad a second example in terms of like not having a macro understanding is that you may know what you're good at in terms of when you're deciding who who is responsible for what in a specific project, and what like Joe is good at when deciding who is doing what in a project. It's also relevant to know what other work Joe is working on and what other work everyone else is working on, and whether it's important rather or worth the cost of them being taken away from that work to work on this project. This is something that a manager can do to a much greater degree, which is why we have those people in the first place. Therefore, we think allowing employees to make these decisions without the macro understanding, or to significantly contribute to these decisions without the macro understanding, is going to lead to worse decisions. No, thank you. The second reason then is that we think employees generally tend to have, understandably, but selfish incentives. Why, right? Because we live in a capitalist society, and we think that people are generally taught, and this makes perfect sense, that they have their own family to take care of, that they should prioritize their own job performance, their own career progression, etc. The problem, though, is that this often disregards and is counterproductive to other people in the workplace. For instance, if an acquisition of another factory by this company, and you're working in the quality control department, this now means that you, as the quality control department of this company, will have to compete, of this factory rather, will have to compete with the other one. And so maybe mistakes that you make are much more obvious to your boss. And this will lead to maybe you getting fired or reprimanded or whatever. This might be bad for you, but overall good for the company if the company is better able to decide who is doing their job better and what methods are better for quality control in that instance. The third reason is that we think many employees tend to be older and not understand things like a lot of new technology or AI, etc., which often in many fields are incredibly important, and it's important for you to be able to use these to your advantage as a company. The fourth reason then why we think employees are often going to make bad decisions or give bad criticisms and therefore lead to bad decisions is because I think a lot of time is wasted. Opening government tells you that you're going to have large meetings where everyone pitches in. This either means that the employees are going to stay for extra hours at work, like extra 2 hours a day, which sounds horrible, or more likely we think this means that you're going to be working a lot less and spending a lot more and being less efficient overall. Again, this is bad for the company. Before I explain why company success is tied to good for society, I'll take the POI from opening government.
While CG are stylistically persuasive, they're mechanistically entirely derivative. Your own opening explains that upper management doesn't take these decisions seriously, so you're knifing them. Why do upper management actually listen on your comparative?
Your partner said that they do. That's one important thing. Secondly, the first part of my speech explained why you have a snowball effect and why you have to listen to at least some of these decisions. Thirdly, we're not knifing our opening. We're basically just being a lot more charitable to you, taking your best case scenario where you actually get the change that you want. Okay, so you're going to be wasting a lot of time. Why then is company success good for society? 3 reasons. Firstly, because it creates a lot of jobs and allows people to access employment and therefore income. If a firm, for instance, goes bankrupt and other firms don't then acquire the factories or the assets that firm owned, that may mean that those factories shut down. Thousands of people going without a job. That is what the type of harm that we avoid on our side. But secondly, because companies tend to be responsive to consumer demand, the only way they can make money is if consumers are willing to pay that. So we think when people want these things, but there's less efficiency in the cost of production of cars, for instance, that means that consumers end up bearing the cost, car prices end up going higher, and it's harder for consumers to access things like mobility and transport. But the third reason as to why company success is very good for society is shareholders, right? We think many of these things like pension funds or individuals own shares in these companies. And so therefore, when a company is doing well, the pension fund does well. And this pays for people's retirements. We think this is incredibly important in upkeeping our society. Overall, we actually fill and take up the burden of this debate. We explain why the decisions that are going to be made and the criticisms that are going to be given by the employees are likely to be harmful for the company. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you, Emil. Whip.
Hi, am I clearly audible and visible?
Yes, to both.
Cool. Okay, right. Ask POIs, however, unmute and ask, or ask in the chat, or wave. I'll probably take one at some point in my speech, preferably from opening. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. 3 things I'll be doing in this speech. First, I'm going to remove CO from the debate. Then I'm going to delete O from the debate. And then I'm going to explain why we over our opening. Okay, let's talk about CO first. I think the biggest problem with CO is just that they don't seem to understand how corporations and upper level management actually works. CO's entire case hinges on the idea that the structural change of low level employees will be implemented by upper management, and these structural ideas are really, really bad. 3 responses. 1, I don't think they understand the scale at which companies work, right? If you have 60,000 different employees, all of whom have certain dissenting issues with the way the companies run, it is probably untrue that upper or even middle level management is going to be able to process all or even a majority of those complaints. Second, they never actually analyze the incentives of upper or middle level management. Because yes, maybe when you have a culture of dissent, you do to some extent want to accommodate your workers. But you know what's more important? Your fiduciary obligation to like your shareholders who pay your wages and like keep cash within the company. And you therefore probably know that if these reforms that are being suggested are very disastrous, you probably won't do that in the first place, because you've got to think long term. And you'll probably tell yourself as an upper level executive, oh, if I do this, this is just going to harm more workers in the long term. But third, like oftentimes it's like a direct financial incentive where like oftentimes upper level management is given bonuses based on how well the company performs. So again, if they institute reforms that are bad, which is what CEO wants to insinuate, they don't get those bonuses. So the TLDR here is the incentives not to like, so the TLDR here is A, the incentives for like upper level management not to implement reforms or complaints that are really, really bad are like massively outweighing their incentives to do so. But B, just on capacity, they don't have the scale to vet all of the complaints that come in. So realistically, this debate is not about like upper level management going through like, or CEOs or CFOs going through like every single like problem that like every single structural problem that workers have with the way in which the company is run. In cases where structural changes do happen, we think these structural changes are likely to be good, because the way in which this realistically works is when you have many, many suggestions coming in, those suggestions have to be vetted by someone before being implemented. Insofar as you can't implement the vast majority of them, you likely pick a few of those that are likely to be the most implementable or the best. And therefore, in a world where the structural change does accrue, we think that structural change is likely to be good. I really think this takes out CEO. But I just want to bring back the extension that Nicole gives you on departmental change and why that brings us to debate, because CEO is just incredibly dismissive about it, right? Because CEO is like, this doesn't really matter and like this doesn't really work. Here's the problem. Two things, right? One, Nicole tells you that like the problem in the current corporate atmosphere is oftentimes like it's very hierarchical, right? Like there's no dissent even about small things like what permission did you do to get the printer, whether or not the software you're using for your programming like is actually user friendly or not. Just like the protocols with which like you interact with customers, or like the ways in which you like tender contracts to contractors and things like that. Oftentimes there is no questioning of the middle management happens here. But second, I actually do think that this is the place where there's the greatest margin in the debate, and this is critically why we're over opening government as well. Why is this the case? Because opening government's model of you can have small meetings where like all of your workers like voice their opinions is probably most likely in those departmental meetings where you have 10 workers and like 1 or 2 managers, and where everyone can actually speak and have their opinions heard. Notice that insofar as maybe these managers aren't like stupid or bad people, it's just that like when you're managing the department, you sometimes lose sight of like certain inefficiencies that come in the process, or like certain like really ridiculous rules around like what sort of software you have to use, or things like when exactly you can use the printer. Yes, that's when like inefficiencies arise and like employees like feel worse. The reason why this is incredibly important and CEOs trivializing if this doesn't really work is very, very simple. Nicole already tells you this, but I'm just going to repeat it for your benefit. Insofar as the single most proximate impact towards the low-level employees is literally what their on-ground working conditions are, is literally like how pissed they're likely to be at stupid things that happen in the office. Insofar as we give them a mechanism to complain about it, and know that this is unique because as Nicole also explained, you're probably unlikely to go to HR over these small interdepartmental issues. That is the point at which we just make their everyday working experience much, much better. Insofar as structural change is often incredibly difficult to get because of the profit incentives of corporations, because of things like corporate lobbies, because of the fact that like, they can fire you and there's a massive like bargaining power imbalance. Insofar as that's the case, and no other team actually engages with this reality, we're the only team in this debate that gets the definite impact of actually improving the working conditions and working experiences of the workers on the ground. But then, like, why is it that we actually do give you something on structural change? Here's the issue, right? The issue here on structural change is this. Collective bargaining is far more effective on our side, which is the third extension which Nicole gives you, again, completely dropped by CEO. I feel like Opwood was a little too late to respond to it for the first time. What does Nicole tell you? Basically, it's this. When you have like formalized complaint systems like HR or just complaining by being passive aggressive, that is when fellow employees don't really know where they all stand, and that is where like they think that okay, this complaint is only unique to me, or that is when like they think that the risks of unionizing or like collective bargaining might outweigh the benefits. At the point at which you have a culture of dissent and everyone in your like departmental pod has likely the same complaints, or like everyone thinks that XYZ manager is like really mean or whatever, that's the point at which like you can actually like get information on how to collectivize most effectively, or like what issues are actually common amongst all workers. So we're actually the side that has a margin on making collectivization much more beneficial. The reason why this wins us, the
Point of
reason why this
information.
vote takes CEO out of the debate and why this wins us the debate is very, very simple. Insofar as structural change is often very difficult, and insofar as the ways in which like corporations actually work often just make the process really, really slow, the clearest margin is on those departmental everyday changes. And I think at this point I've like proved that enough for you. Insofar as we make the on-ground day-to-day work experience better, we win. Okay, I'm going to take O out of this debate. Before that, yeah, PO, preferably opening.
This is closing.
Insofar as the vast majority of worker dissatisfaction is likely to stem from these structural problems, and this culture does nothing about it according to your own concession, won't people feel far more disillusioned and be unwilling to engage with the culture itself?
No, I don't buy that. Like, why does it stem from structural issues? One, look, we've already proven to you why like structural change is actually more likely, and we do have a margin, which was the unionization and collective bargaining extension that Nicole gives you that is unresponded to. But second, like, no, like small microaggressions within your department really piss you off and like massively impact how satisfied you are with your work. Like, I've never worked in an office. But anyways, okay, cool. Let's take O out of this debate. O basically says, oh, people should complain formally through HR. If they don't, then like upper management does bad things to them and like there's backlash. Okay, look, two things, right? One, HR is symmetric. HR exists on our side of the house as well. So even in their best case, they literally have no margin of change. O cannot win this debate. But second, like Nicole tells you why it is that oftentimes people aren't willing to escalate to HR. Either A, because they think the small microaggression, the yelling they got from their boss was like not important enough to address to HR, or B, just because like going through a formalized process of anonymous email chains is really, really taxing on them. Having this personalized face-to-face interactions means they're far more likely to complain, and that's the point at which you're likely to get those changes. I think that takes out the O. Finally, why do we weigh out OG? Firstly, just like as I've already spent a lot of time proving to you, like we actually get the more definite impact, and we're also the only side that actually mechanizes the impact for you. But second, I think the issue with OG is OG never proves why current systems of collectivization or human resources don't actually work. We critically do that for you. I get that OG sounds really good, but just like saying here in the chat whenever like we speak doesn't mean they get to claim our benefits. Our benefits are unique, and the most important in this debate. Clear CG first. Thank you.
Thanks to the Gov Whip, the opposition whip.
Hi, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, both.
Wonderful. For the exact reasons Leo told you in his extension, I think after government whip, our case still stands. I'll talk to you about two broad questions in this speech. First of all, what does this criticism look like? And second of all, why it is actively counterproductive. I will explain why we take out all things throughout. So first question then, how does this criticism look like? Where does it apply? Is it the bigger issues or is it the smaller issues? I think we generally would agree with opening government when they say that we're talking about big things, for the reason they tell you that, look, if it's a small issue, if it's something like what type of software you're using, where the printer is placed in the office so everyone has more access to it, that type of stuff, I don't think you really need a culture for that, an entire culture of like dissent, etc. I think if it's a fairly sensible and minor change, like reasonable managers would already change it. I don't think this is the crux of the debate. I think this already mitigates most of CG. But second of all, I think the bigger issues, things like automation, replacement, restructuring of the company of the different departments and moving people around are the much more pressing concerns of the workers, because that affects their day-to-day lives a lot more than the type of processing software they might use for something or something like that. So I think if you don't actually give them the things they are most concerned about, you cannot at the same time build this culture. I think this is better than OO, because look, OO says this won't be received properly and tries to contest the extent to which employers will listen. We are different from that. More charitable to like open government, we're engaging them at their best level. But second of all, I think they're pretty short-termist, because in the long run, both teams agree that corporate has a power imbalance with the employees. So if corporate has power imbalance and a lot of time, I think they will reasonably be able to enforce this culture. I think this is pretty short-termist, then we actually apply it in the long run. Then why will these decisions be bad, and why is the most important thing? Leo gives you a bunch of reasons as to why primarily employees either don't know what is best for the company broadly, for the like team, for the managerial like group broadly, etc. But second of all, that they oftentimes have fairly understandable yet still counterproductive incentives, that they are self-serving, that they are selfish, that they might not actually want what's best for the company, but they might want their promotion in the short term. How does this impact each team? I think first of all, it takes out opening government. because most of their case hinges on the following. They tell you that there are good incentives on the side of the employees, that they want their job stability, that they want, that their manager is going to try to do this well because there's more accountability mechanisms, all of that stuff. No, this doesn't actually address if the employees are capable of making these decisions, because we can trust that even if you don't buy our mechanisms as to why these are like self-serving or counterproductive, reasons for which the workers are speaking, this still doesn't mean they understand what is best for the team, they understand what is best for the work environment. This means we will have privileged them and their case is just taken out for that. But second of all, they tell you that, look, you can self-select for good ideas. I actually think this can't happen when when there's an entire culture of criticism, because there's so much criticism that you don't have a control group. So you can't see when there is criticism and what type of it exists and compare that with groups where there isn't the same criticism, so you can actually have a fair comparison. But second of all, you can't select because everyone is criticizing their employees for everything. So it's just difficult for you to pick out what is most effective. At this point, I think we have reasonably taken out both openings with our extension, and we have done a better job. What does CG then do? They tell you in response to our extension that, look, you have the structural changes unlikely to manifest because they won't listen, because they have a fiduciary responsibility and other incentives, etc. I think, first of all, this is a knifing of their OG, and they haven't cleared up why that's okay for them, so that's not good for them. But even if you think that's okay, even if you still think they're more important than OG, I don't think the bosses either necessarily understand if this is good criticism, where they're coming from, because there's so much criticism, there's a lot of it which you need to sort through. I don't think they can actually tell if this is good or bad. But also, not very importantly, it is contradictory with their third extension, because if this is a culture of actually favoring the employee over the employer, then it would follow that they would, to an extent, have to disadvantage the fiduciary responsibility and profit maximization to get this culture in the first place. So these can't actually coexist. I think it's fair to say that you are affecting structural changes as well, both for the reasons OG and CO provided. Before addressing more direct responses to CG, I'll take a POI from CG, if there is one.
Yeah. Why exactly is it that where exactly does upper management get the capacity to make sure that all of these changes that workers suggest become implemented?
For all of the stuff OG told you about, the meetings, the complaint forms, the emails which you will write and will be formalized, and there will be all of these wonderful accountability mechanisms, is exactly how upper management gets to these decisions, exactly why these decisions are big and harmful and counterproductive. What does CG tell you? First of all, they try to shrink this debate to talk about very minor stuff, type of software you're using, etc. Here's the thing: even if they want to backstab DPM, our reasoning still applies. Pilots might be old and not understand new market trends or new software or how artificial intelligence can be used to optimize a workforce. It doesn't just apply on big stuff, it also applies on small stuff. How your department uses artificial intelligence, and you giving that advice to your boss, you're giving that complaint, would be counterproductive. Similarly, the pilots might be selfish and competitive, means you might have an incentive to disregard valid criticism of someone because you don't want them to get the promotion, and you're actually going to start arguing with them so they don't look as good, so they look worse than you, and therefore you're more likely to get a promotion than someone else, even in the micro level. Therefore, just clearly, our case has already addressed this since Leo's. And second of all, the minor stuff is still bad. I'm going to explain later why you need
last chance.
It's important. No, thank you. And lastly, I think you don't need the whole culture for this. I have already explained this in the beginning. Similarly, this addresses the stuff they talk about, the vulnerable people speaking out. I don't care if they're speaking out in and of itself, if what they're saying is bad and counterproductive for the firm, etc. Lastly, they never explained to us why unions are good. This is a link which was missing, not something they can actually bring up in a POI, because I'm going to protect the time right now. Lastly, let's be very charitable to CG. Even if it's mainly about minor departmental change, I think efficiency is much more important, simply but because it adds up. The fact that the whole department is working less effectively might not manifest to that much in the short term, but this might lead to some layoffs. 2 or 3 people might lose their job because everyone is acting less efficiently, because they're spending and wasting hours on meetings, etc. We think it's just much more important than having an extra boss, because this means people don't have access to income, they can't progress their careers, and I think, just simply put, the material benefits of your job are more important than how you feel in it, because simply put, I think most people try to compartmentalize, focus on their life afterwards, and not actually, live to work, etc. So for all of these reasons, I think job stability, which we have shown you, when the firm is acting efficiently, when the firm is acting for the best, in the best way it can, is the most important thing for workers, is the most important thing for society broadly, for the impacts brought in Leo's. We're very proud to be in CL.
Thank you very much. Closing opposition whip for your speech. That concludes the round. Thanks everyone for the debate. I and my panel will move